We always knew you'd end up fine on your own. You were the tough one, remember? That's what we told ourselves. My mother said that to me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice cracking through a phone connection from Portland, Oregon. 17 years. 17 years of nothing, and that was the sentence she chose to break the silence. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." Just a tidy little revision of history, packaged up so she could sleep at night. She always had a gift for that, turning abandonment into a compliment, making neglect sound like a parenting philosophy. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit there between us like a living thing. I could hear her breathing. I could hear the television in the background, some game show, the audience clapping about something that didn't matter. I thought about all the things I could say, all the years of rehearsed speeches, the fury I'd swallowed so many times it had become part of my chemical composition. But none of it came. Instead, what rose up in me was something quieter and far more dangerous than anger. Clarity. Because I knew something she didn't. I knew why she was really calling, and it wasn't love. It wasn't guilt. It was the fact that 3 days earlier, my name had appeared on the front page of the Billings Gazette, then the Associated Press Wire, then a feature in the Denver Post. She hadn't called because she missed me. She'd called because other people suddenly knew I existed, and that made my absence from her life inconvenient to explain. My name is Elaine Calloway. I'm 32 years old. I'm a senior structural engineer with the Montana Department of Transportation, and last month I led the team that redesigned the Rimrock Bridge project outside Billings after the original contractor's plans were found to have critical flaws that could have killed people. The governor mentioned me by name at a press conference. There was a photograph of me in a hard hat, standing on a ridge above the Yellowstone River, and it went wider than anyone expected. Someone wrote a human interest piece. The headline read, "The Woman Who Stopped a Bridge from Falling." It was a good photo. I looked calm in it. I looked like someone who had always been certain of herself. The truth is more complicated than that. This is the story of how my family left me behind when I was 15 years old, moved 1,100 miles away without looking back, and then wept when they found out who I became without them. But it's also the story of something else, something I didn't understand for a long time. It's the story of how silence, the kind that settles into your bones when you realize no one is coming back for you, can either hollow you out or become the foundation you build everything on. I got lucky, or stubborn, probably both. Let me go back. I grew up in Billings, Montana, in a neighborhood called the South Side, near the train tracks where Burlington Northern freight cars rattled through at 2 in the morning. Our house was a 2-bedroom on Clark Avenue with a chain-link fence and a cottonwood tree in the backyard that dropped so many seeds every June it looked like snow. My father, Dean Calloway, drove a delivery truck for a building supply company. My mother, Sheila, worked part-time at a dentist's office doing filing and insurance claims. I had 2 older brothers, Tyler and Marcus, who were 17 and 19 when everything changed. We were not a dramatic family. That's the thing people never understand when I tell this story. They expect violence, addiction, some made-for-TV crisis. But there was nothing like that. We were the most ordinary people in the world. We ate hamburger helper on Wednesdays. My dad watched the Grizzlies play on Saturdays. My mom kept coupons in a shoebox on the refrigerator. The drama was all underneath, the way it always is in families that look fine from the outside. The person who saw it was my grandfather, my dad's father, Walter Calloway, who lived alone in a duplex on 6th Street after my grandmother passed. Grandpa Walt was a retired lineman for Northwestern Energy. He had hands like weathered leather and a gap between his front teeth, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like he was reading a page of your life that you hadn't written yet. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He could say more with a long silence and a slow nod than most people could say with 100 words. I used to walk to his place after school. It was 11 blocks, and I'd cut through the Rimrocks trailhead to get there, scrambling up the sandstone and then dropping down into his neighborhood from the ridge. He always had the door unlocked. There was always coffee on the stove, the percolator kind, and he'd pour me half a cup with enough milk to turn it the color of caramel. One afternoon, I was maybe 13, I told him that my mother had forgotten to pick me up from a school event, an awards ceremony. I'd won a math competition, district level, and she was supposed to be there at 6. By 7, the janitor was stacking chairs, and I was sitting on the curb outside Riverside Middle School with my certificate in my lap. She eventually came. She said she'd lost track of time. She didn't ask what the certificate was for. I told Grandpa Walt this like it was nothing, like I was reporting the weather. He listened. He poured more coffee. Then he set the pot down and looked at me with those pale gray eyes and said something I carry to this day. Elaine, some people can only see what's standing right in front of them. That's not your flaw. That's theirs. But you need to know something. The world will not always come find you. Sometimes, you have to go stand where the light is and wait for them to turn around. And if they never turn around, then you learn to be your own light. That's not sad. That's grown. I didn't fully understand it then. I was 13. I thought he was just being poetic, the way old people sometimes are. I folded it up and put it away in the same place I put everything I didn't know what to do with. But I remembered it, every word. I should tell you who I was before everything fell apart, because otherwise none of what comes next will make sense. My name is Elaine Calloway. I was born in Akron, Ohio, in a house on Thornton Street that smelled like radiator heat and my mother's hairspray. My father, Dennis, worked at a tire manufacturing plant. Not on the floor, he was quick to remind people, but in logistics. He wore a tie to work every day, even though nobody required it. My mother, Sandra, was a dental hygienist who quit when my younger brother Connor was born and never went back. Connor came along when I was 6. From the moment he arrived, the math in our household changed. I don't say that with bitterness. I'm stating a fact. Connor was a loud baby, a demanding toddler, and by the time he was in school, he was the kind of kid teachers called spirited when they wanted to be kind and exhausting when they didn't. He had attention issues. He had behavioral incidents. He needed tutoring, then a different tutor, then a specialist, then a therapist who cost $200 a session and didn't take insurance. My parents orbited Connor like planets around a sun. That was their whole gravitational system, and I was somewhere out past the asteroid belt, quiet and cold and doing just fine on my own, thank you. And I was fine. That's the strange part. I was an excellent student. Not the flashy kind who raises her hand and corrects the teacher, the kind who turns in clean work, scores in the 98th percentile on standardized tests, and gets one line on her report card that says, "Elaine is a pleasure to have in class." That one line was the extent of most conversations about me at home. My mother would read it, nod, stick the report card to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a strawberry, and then spend 45 minutes on the phone with Connor's school about his latest incident. I'd hear her voice from my bedroom, tight and rising. She never used that voice for me. I never gave her a reason to. I was small for my age, thin-wristed, with dark brown hair I kept in a braid because nobody ever taught me to do anything else with it. I had a habit of standing with my arms crossed, not out of defiance, but because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I read constantly. Library books mostly. I liked biographies of women who did things nobody expected them to do. Amelia Earhart, Marie Curie, Harriet Tubman. Women who walked into rooms that weren't built for them and stayed anyway. I didn't think of myself as one of them. I just liked knowing they existed. My grandfather, Eugene, was the one who saw me. He lived alone in a small house in Cuyahoga Falls, about 20 minutes from us, and I spent weekends there whenever my parents needed the space, which was often. He had been a machinist at a tool and die shop for 37 years before retiring. His hands were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, and when he held a coffee cup, it looked like a thimble. He taught me to play chess. He taught me to change a tire. He taught me that silence is not the same as weakness, that watching is not the same as doing nothing. That phrase he told me, about being your own light. He said it on a Sunday morning in his kitchen. I was 13. The linoleum was cracked near the stove, and his radio was playing something with horns. I had just told him, casually, like it didn't matter, that my parents had forgotten to pick me up from a school science fair the night before. I had won second place. I waited in the parking lot for an hour and a half before calling Grandpa Eugene from the school office phone. He came and bought me without a word. The next morning, over coffee, he let me drink half milk. He said what he said. He also told me something else that day, quieter, almost like he was talking to himself. He said, "You've got a patient mind, Elaine. That's rare. Most people want to be seen right now, today, this minute. You're willing to wait. That's a gift. But don't let anyone mistake your patience for permission." I didn't understand that one either, not then. What I understood was this. I had a body that didn't take up much space, and a voice that didn't carry far, and a family that had arranged itself around someone else's needs so completely that my absence from a room could go unnoticed for hours. I knew the exact feeling of sitting at the dinner table while my father talked about Connor's upcoming evaluation, and my mother planned Connor's schedule, and nobody asked me a single question until my father glanced over and said, "You're quiet tonight, Lainey," like it was an observation about the weather. I was always quiet. That was the whole point. That was the thing nobody understood. My silence wasn't emptiness, it was storage. I was keeping everything. Every skipped recital. Every forgotten permission slip my grandfather had to sign because my parents didn't read the paperwork. Every time my mother said, "Elaine can handle it, she's the easy one." As though being easy was the same as being fine. As though not needing help meant not needing anything at all. I had a bad left knee from a fall off my bicycle when I was 11. I hit a curb wrong and something in the joint never healed right. It ached in cold weather. I never told anyone because the one time I mentioned it, my mother said, "Just put some ice on it, honey," and went back to arguing with Connor's school on the phone. So I limped slightly in winter and sat with my legs straight under my desk, and nobody noticed because nobody was looking. That was me at 15. A girl with a limp nobody saw, a brain nobody asked about, and a grandfather who was the only person in my life who had ever looked at me and thought, "There's more here than what's showing." The first time they forgot me was at a restaurant. I was 12. We had driven to a place called Carrabba's on Route 9 in Framingham for my mother's birthday. Connor had been fighting with my father the entire drive about whether he could get his learner's permit early, and Megan had been crying because she wanted to sit in the front seat and nobody would let her. I sat in the back middle, with my knees pressed together and my hands in my lap, and I watched the strip malls go by through the windshield between my parents' headrests. When we got to the restaurant, everybody piled out. Connor slammed his door. Megan ran ahead. My mother was already talking to the hostess by the time I unbuckled my seatbelt. I walked in last and stood behind a fake potted plant near the entrance for almost 4 minutes before my father turned around and said, "Oh, there you are," like I had been the one who wandered off. They ordered bruschetta for the table, and nobody asked if I wanted something different. I don't like tomatoes. I never have. But nobody in my family knew that because nobody had ever asked. That was the first time. I remember it because I wrote it down later in a composition notebook I kept under my mattress. I didn't call it a diary. I called it evidence. I'm not sure what I thought I was building a case for. Maybe just proof that I existed, and that things happened to me, and that I wasn't making it up. The second time was bigger. I was 13 and I had won a regional science fair with a project on water filtration using sand and activated charcoal. My teacher, Mrs. Hensley, had nominated me. The ceremony was on a Saturday morning at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and I needed a ride. I told my mother on Tuesday. I reminded her on Thursday. On Friday night, she said she remembered. On Saturday morning, she drove Connor to an emergency orthodontist appointment in Natick because he had broken a bracket eating caramel corn. And by the time she got back, the ceremony was over. I called Mrs. Hensley from the house phone and told her I had the stomach flu. Mrs. Hensley said she was sorry and that they had called my name and nobody came up. She said they gave my certificate to another teacher to hold for me. I got it the following Monday in a manila envelope. I opened it alone in the girls' bathroom during lunch. First place, Regional Division. My name printed in a font that looked like calligraphy. I stared at it for a long time, and then I folded it and put it in my backpack, and never showed it to anyone. My mother never mentioned it again. I don't think she remembered it had happened. The third time was the one that left a mark. I was 14 and Connor was 17, and he had gotten suspended from school for 3 days for shoving a kid into a locker. My parents drove to the school together. They met with the principal. They hired a counselor. For 3 weeks, the entire household revolved around Connor's anger issues. My father took him fishing on the weekends. My mother cooked his favorite meals. Megan got extra attention too, because she was upset that Connor was upset, and my mother said we all need to support each other right now. During those same 3 weeks, I had my first period. I figured it out on my own using the internet and a box of pads I found under the bathroom sink. I washed my own stained underwear in the bathtub at night when everyone was asleep. I never told my mother because the house was so full of Connor's crisis that there was no room for anything else, certainly not something as ordinary as a girl becoming a woman. I handled it. I always handled it. And every time I handled something alone, the distance between me and the rest of them grew a little wider. And none of them noticed the gap because they were all standing on the other side of it, together. The fourth time was the one that should have made me angry. It was the spring I was 15. My grandfather had been gone for almost 2 months by then, and the house felt like it was made of paper. My father came home one evening and sat everyone down at the kitchen table. He said he had been offered a transfer to a new position in Charlotte, North Carolina. Better salary, better benefits. A fresh start, he said. He looked at my mother and she nodded. He looked at Connor and Connor shrugged. He looked at Megan and Megan asked if she could have a bigger room. Then he looked at me and I opened my mouth to ask a question. Something about the timeline, about school, about whether we would all go together. But before I could speak, my mother said, "We'll figure out the details later." And then she stood up and started making dinner. The details, it turned out, did not include me. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched my family pack up the house box by box. I watched my mother wrap dishes in newspaper. I watched Connor throw out half his clothes and complain about sharing a moving truck. I watched Megan label her boxes with colored markers. And slowly, in small conversations I was never quite part of, the plan took shape. Connor and Megan would transfer schools. My mother would find work in Charlotte, and I would stay behind with my Aunt Ruth in Worcester so I could finish my sophomore year without disruption. Because I was the one doing well. I was the stable one, and it would only be temporary, just until summer, and then they would send for me. My mother said it like she was doing me a favor. My father said it like it was already decided. And the worst part? The part that I replay sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, is that nobody asked me. Not once. They told me, they explained, they reassured, but they never once sat me down and said, "What do you want? What do you need? Are you okay with this?" Because they already knew the answer. I was the easy one. The easy one was always okay. I stood in the driveway and watched the moving truck pull away on a Sunday morning in June. My father waved from the driver's seat. My mother blew a kiss from the passenger window. Megan pressed her face to the glass in the back of their car and made a silly face at me, and Connor didn't look up from his phone. I stood there with my bad knee aching and a garbage bag at my feet containing the things that didn't fit in Aunt Ruth's spare bedroom. I stood there until the truck turned the corner and disappeared, and the street was quiet, and a neighbor's sprinkler started up, and I realized that no one had said when they would call. That sprinkler ran for 40 minutes. I know because I stood there listening to it, counting the arcs of water hitting the sidewalk, watching the dark patches spread across the concrete. Aunt Ruth finally opened the screen door behind me and said, "You coming in, or you planning to grow roots?" And something about the way she said it, not gentle, not harsh, just factual, made me pick up the garbage bag and walk inside. I didn't cry that night. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what comes next. I didn't cry that night, or the next night, or the night after that. I unpacked my things into the small dresser in Ruth's spare room, the room that smelled like mothballs and old paperbacks, and I folded my clothes carefully, and I lined up my shoes by the closet door, and I went to bed at 10, and I got up at 6, and I went to school, and I came home, and I did homework at the kitchen table, while Ruth watched her shows in the living room. I was 15 years old, and I was performing normalcy like it was a role I had been hired to play. The first week, I checked my phone constantly, every vibration, every notification. I had this certainty, this absolute bone-deep certainty, that my mother would call that evening, or maybe the next morning, to tell me about the new house, to describe my room, to say they had set something aside for me, to say they missed me, to ask how school was. The call didn't come Monday. It didn't come Tuesday. On Wednesday, my father sent a text that said, "Settling in, house is great, hope school is good." And I stared at that text for 10 minutes, trying to decode it, trying to find the warmth in it, trying to read between the lines for the thing he surely meant but didn't say. By the second week, I had stopped checking my phone. Here is what I understood then, standing in Aunt Ruth's kitchen one Thursday evening while she heated up canned soup because neither of us could cook worth a damn. I understood it suddenly, without build-up, without a gradual dawning. It arrived the way a bone breaks, all at once. They were not coming back for me. They had not left me behind temporarily. They had not made a painful strategic decision that kept them awake at night. They had simply continued their lives, and I was not in the frame anymore. I was the part of the photograph that gets cropped out, not because anyone hates it, but because the composition looks cleaner without it. Ruth set a bowl of tomato soup in front of me, and I said, "They're not going to call, are they?" And Ruth, God bless her, did not lie to me. She sat down across the table and blew on her spoon and said, "Probably not the way you need them to." "No," I nodded. The soup was too hot and burned the roof of my mouth, and I didn't care. That was the moment. Not rage, not grief, not some cinematic breaking point where I threw things or screamed into a pillow. It was soup burning my mouth in a kitchen that smelled like old linoleum, and the quiet clicking of Ruth's spoon against the bowl, and the understanding, cold and complete like ice water filling a glass, that I was alone. That I had been alone for years and had simply refused to notice. That every time I had been the easy one, the good one, the one who didn't need anything, I had been building the scaffolding for my own abandonment. I had made it so easy to leave me that leaving me became the obvious choice. I set down my spoon. I looked at Ruth. She was watching me with those sharp gray eyes, the same eyes my grandfather had, and she didn't say anything comforting. She just watched and waited. I said, "I need to get a job." She said, "You're 15. I said, "I need to get a job and I need to save money, and I need to figure out how to apply to college because no one is going to do that for me. Ruth took another sip of soup. Then she said something I will carry with me until the day I die. She said, "Your grandfather told me once that the people who survive aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who learn to fall quiet." You fall quiet, Nora. You get up, and you don't make a sound, and you get to work. The world will catch up eventually. Fall quiet. At the time, I thought she meant be silent, be invisible, endure. It took me 17 years to understand what she actually meant. But that night, I made a decision. It wasn't dramatic, there was no music, there was no moment of steely determination where I stared at my reflection and made promises. I simply washed my soup bowl, dried it, put it back in the cabinet, and went to my room and opened my laptop and started researching scholarship programs for students with no parental financial support. I made a spreadsheet. I listed deadlines. I calculated what I would need to earn per month working part-time to cover application fees. I typed until midnight, and then I closed the laptop and lay in the dark and listened to Ruth snoring through the thin wall and the distant sound of a train passing through the east side of town. I did not cry. I was done with that. I was done waiting for someone to notice that I was worth noticing. I was done being the easy one. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I was angry, but because I had finally, at 15, in a spare room that smelled like mothballs, understood the simplest truth of my life. No one was coming. No one was going to rescue me or choose me or fight for me. If I wanted a life, I would have to build it with my own hands, in silence, with no audience and no applause. And I would. That summer I got a job bussing tables at a diner on 4th Street called Rosie's. The owner was not named Rosie. His name was Gary, and he was a quiet man with a bad hip who paid me $6.25 an hour under the table because I was 15 and he was not supposed to employ me full-time. I worked breakfast and lunch shifts 6 days a week, and I saved everything. I opened a checking account at the credit union on Maple Avenue with Ruth as the co-signer, and I watched the numbers grow slowly, like something stubborn pushing through concrete. Ruth never asked me what I was saving for. She was not a curious woman by nature. She fed me, she kept the heat on, she reminded me to lock the front door, and she left me alone. That was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in a long time, leaving me alone to become whoever I was going to become without commentary. I enrolled myself at Franklin High School that fall. I walked the 7 blocks each morning with a backpack I had bought at Goodwill for $3, a green JanSport with a broken zipper on the front pocket. I sat in the second row of every class because I had read somewhere that teachers remember the students who sit close but not too close. I did not raise my hand often. When I did, I made sure I was right. By October, I had a 4.0. By December, I had caught the attention of my AP history teacher, a woman named Mrs. Alderman, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had a habit of tapping her pen against her teeth when she was thinking. She stopped me after class one afternoon and said, "You write like someone who has been paying attention to the world for a lot longer than 16 years. I said thank you, and I left, and I sat in the bathroom stall for 5 minutes pressing my palms flat against my knees because no teacher had ever said anything like that to me before, and I did not know what to do with it. I did not tell Mrs. Alderman about my family. I did not tell anyone. When people asked where I lived, I said, with my aunt. When they asked about my parents, I said they traveled for work. The lie was so small and so ordinary that no one ever questioned it, and that was the thing about being left behind. The world does not investigate quiet children. It just steps around them. I applied for scholarships in my junior year, 17 of them. I sat at the computer in the public library on Saturdays, and I typed essays about resilience and overcoming adversity, and I used words like determination and perseverance because that is what scholarship committees want to hear. I never wrote about what actually happened. I never wrote, "My mother forgot to leave a forwarding address," or "My father chose a woman who found me inconvenient." I wrote about the abstract version of hardship, the kind that sounds inspiring instead of ugly, and I polished every sentence until it gleamed. I won 4 of the 17. 2 were small, a few $100s each. One was a $1,000 award from a local women's organization that met at the Elks Lodge on Wednesday evenings. The 4th was a half-tuition scholarship to the state university, and when the letter arrived at Ruth's house in a thin white envelope, I stood in the kitchen and read it 3 times, and then I folded it neatly and put it in the top drawer of the dresser in my room, beneath the socks, next to the photograph of my grandfather holding me on the porch. Ruth saw my face at dinner that night and said, "Good news." I said yes. She nodded once and passed me the mashed potatoes, and that was the entire conversation. I graduated second in my class. I would have been first, but I got a B+ in AP Calculus because I missed 2 days with the flu in March and could not make up the lab work in time. I did not attend the graduation dinner because it cost $40 per plate, and I had already allocated that money toward my first semester's textbook fund. I went to the ceremony itself wearing a dress Ruth lent me, navy blue with small white buttons, too big in the shoulders. I walked across the stage, and I heard Ruth clap from somewhere in the middle of the bleachers, and that single pair of hands was enough. It had to be enough. I did not look for my family in the audience. I knew they were not there. I knew they did not know. I had not called my mother since the day I dialed her number from Ruth's phone, 8 months after she left, and heard a child laughing in the background, a child that was not me, and my mother's voice saying, hold on, I'm on the phone." And then she had come back and said, "Hello," and I had said, "It's Marlene," and there had been a pause so long I could hear the television playing something with a laugh track, and she had said, "Oh, honey, how are you?" And I had said, "I'm fine." And she had said, "That's good, that's really good. Listen, can I call you back?" And she never did. That was the last time I reached out. I sealed that door with silence, and I never touched it again. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Some doors stay closed because opening them costs more than what's on the other side is worth, and I had already spent too much of my life knocking. I moved into a dormitory room the August I turned 18. I had a suitcase, 2 boxes of books, a second-hand laptop I had bought with diner money, and the photograph of my grandfather. I set it on the desk facing my bed so it would be the first thing I saw every morning. I started classes the following Monday. I declared pre-law because Mrs. Alderman had told me once that I argued like someone who had been building a case her whole life, and she was not wrong. I did not call Ruth often, but when I did, she answered on the second ring and said, "How's the food there?" And I said, "Terrible," and she laughed, a dry, short laugh, and that was how I knew she missed me without either of us having to say so. I sent her a card every Christmas with a $20 bill inside because it was what I could afford, and because she had never once made me feel like a burden. And in this life, that kind of restraint is its own form of love. I graduated summa cum laude from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the spring of 2011, and 3 people were in the audience. Ruth, who wore the same navy dress she wore to every funeral and every graduation because she said the occasions felt equally serious. Mrs. Alderman, who drove 4 hours from Burnsville and brought a potted fern because she said flowers die, but ferns have spine. And a boy named David Kessler, who sat in my constitutional law seminar and had been watching me argue for 2 years before he finally asked if I wanted to get coffee, and I said, "Only if you are paying," and he said, "Always." And that was the beginning of something I did not know I was allowed to have. I went straight to law school at Duke. I took out loans that made my eyes water when I read the numbers, but I also earned a merit scholarship that covered 60% of tuition because my LSAT score was in the 99th percentile, and the admissions counselor looked at my file and then looked at me and said, "Where did you come from?" And I said, "A town so small it does not have a stoplight." And she said, "Well, you write like someone who has been paying attention to everything." I suppose I had been. David waited. He was finishing his MBA at Wake Forest, and he waited without complaint and without pressure, and on the weekends he drove to Durham, and we ate cheap Thai food on the floor of my apartment, and he never once told me I was too serious, or too quiet, or too much of anything. The first time he met Ruth, he shook her hand, and she looked at him for a long time, and then she looked at me and nodded once. And that was all the approval I needed from anyone on this earth. I passed the bar on my first attempt in 2014. I joined a mid-size firm in Charlotte that specialized in family law and estate planning because I understood what it meant to be discarded by the people who were supposed to protect you, and I wanted to stand between that kind of cruelty and the people it landed on. Within 2 years, I had built a client list that was mostly women, mostly mothers, mostly people who had been told they did not deserve what was theirs. I was good at it. Not because I was loud or theatrical, but because I prepared until there was nothing left to surprise me, and because I listened the way Ruth had listened, with my whole body, without interrupting, without rushing to the next thing. Judges noticed. Opposing counsel noticed. By 2018, I was a senior associate, and the firm had put my name on a case that went to the North Carolina Court of Appeals, and we won. And the decision was published, and my full name appeared in the legal record for anyone to find. Emmeline Ruth Holloway. Right there in black and white on a state judiciary website. I married David in October of 2016 in a courthouse ceremony with 11 guests. Ruth sat in the front row, and when the judge pronounced us married, she pressed her lips together very tightly, and I knew she was not going to cry, because Ruth Yancey did not cry in public. But her chin trembled once, and that was worth more than applause. Mrs. Alderman read a poem she had written herself, and it was not very good, but it was honest. And David's parents, who were kind, quiet people from Greensboro, hugged me and called me daughter, and I had to leave the room for a moment, because the word hit a place in my chest I thought I had sealed shut. We bought a house in the Myers Park neighborhood of Charlotte. 3 bedrooms, a yard with a magnolia tree, a kitchen with windows that let in so much light in the morning that I sometimes just stood there, holding my coffee, watching the dust float. I put my grandfather's photograph on the mantel. I put Ruth's Christmas cards in a drawer in my desk. I did not put up any photographs of my parents or my brother or my sister because I did not have any. In the 17 years since they left, I heard from my family exactly 4 times. Once was the letter from my mother's sister Pauline, who wrote to tell me my grandmother on my mother's side had died, and the funeral was in Lexington, Kentucky, and I was welcome to come if I wanted. I did not go because I had not seen that grandmother since I was 6, and because the letter was addressed to occupant, and Pauline had to call Ruth to get my forwarding address, which meant none of them had kept it. The second time was a Facebook message from my sister Lorraine in 2013 that said, "Hey, is this Emmeline?" And I replied, "Yes," and she never wrote back. The third was a voicemail from a number I did not recognize in 2015, just breathing and then a hang-up. And when I looked up the area code, it was Dayton. The fourth was nothing, really, just a silence that had a shape and weight and that I carried the way you carry a stone in your pocket, always aware of it, always adjusting. I did not search for them. I want to be clear about that. I did not Google my father's name. I did not look for my mother on social media. I did not try to find out if Kyle had graduated, or if Lorraine had married, or if my parents had bought a house with enough bedrooms for everyone this time. It was not indifference. It was a choice I made every single morning when I woke up and looked at my grandfather's photograph and remembered what Ruth had said about the wood showing what it always was. I had decided what I was. I was not going to keep checking whether the people who left me behind had noticed. Then, on a Tuesday evening in November of 2022, David and I were eating dinner, and my phone rang, and the caller ID said, Dayton, Ohio. And I set my fork down and looked at it, and David looked at me, and I picked it up, and a woman's voice said, Emmeline. And the voice was older and thinner and shaking, but I knew it the way you know the sound of a door that closed on you a long time ago. It was my mother. She said, Oh my God, Emmeline, we found your name. We saw it online. Honey, are you a lawyer? And she was crying so hard she could barely form the words, and I sat very still at my kitchen table, with the magnolia tree dark outside the window, and I said, Yes, I am. And she said, We had no idea. We had no idea you did all of this. And I said, I know. And she said, Your father wants to talk to you. And I heard him in the background saying, Give me the phone, give me the phone. And I closed my eyes, and I let the silence sit for 3 full seconds before I spoke, because I had waited 17 years, and they could wait 3 seconds. And I said, I am listening. My father's voice came on the line, and it was the voice of an old man. Not the voice I remembered. The man I remembered had a baritone that filled rooms and made waitresses laugh, and made you believe that whatever he was saying was the only version of truth that had ever existed. This voice was thin, reedy. It cracked on the second word. He said, Emmeline, baby, we have been looking for you. I did not say anything. He said, We tried to find you a few years back, but we did not know your married name, and we did not know where you ended up. And I said I never married, and he went quiet for a moment, and then he said, Well, we did not know that either. I let that sit. He said, Your brother found your name on a legal database. You won some big case in Baton Rouge, something about a pipeline company. And he said your picture was right there. And he showed your mother and she started crying and would not stop. And I said, I know about that case. I was there. He laughed. A nervous laugh. The kind people make when they realize they have said something foolish. Of course you were there, he said. Of course. Then he said the thing I had been waiting 17 years to hear, and also the thing I realized I no longer needed. He said we made a mistake leaving you behind. We should not have done that. I know that now. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the reflection of the overhead light in my coffee, and I said, Thank you for saying that. And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. But I also felt the strangest thing, which was almost nothing at all. Like pressing on a bruise that healed so long ago you forgot which leg it was on. He asked if they could come see me. He said they were still in Charlotte. He said my brother Darren had 2 kids now, and my mother had retired from the hospital where she worked intake, and my father himself had had a knee replacement the year before and walked with a cane. And I listened to all of this the way you listen to a neighbor telling you about their vacation. Interested, polite, distant. I said they could come. They drove down 3 weeks later, all of them. My mother and my father and Darren and his wife, whose name was Keisha, and their 2 children, whose names were Miles and Josephine. They pulled up to my house on Britannia Street in a rented minivan, and my mother got out first, and she stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the house and put both hands over her mouth. It is a beautiful house. I will not pretend otherwise. It has a wraparound porch and original ironwork, and the magnolia tree in the side yard is 70 years old and drops white blossoms on the walkway in June. I bought it 9 years ago with money I earned writing briefs at 2 in the morning and arguing motions in courtrooms where nobody gave me anything I did not take for myself. My mother hugged me, and she smelled like the same lotion she always used, that cocoa butter from the drugstore. And for 1/2 of 1 second, I was 15 years old again, standing in an empty apartment listening to the quiet. Then the half-second passed, and I was myself again. My father shook my hand. He did not hug me. He looked at me with an expression I had seen on clients' faces in mediation rooms. It was the expression of someone who knows they are on the wrong side of the facts. We sat on the porch and I made iced tea, and Darren's kids ran around the yard, and Keisha complimented the garden, and for about 20 minutes it felt almost normal, until my mother said, "So tell us everything. Tell us about your life." And I looked at her and I said, "What would you like to know?" And she said, "All of it. From the beginning." I told them some of it. I told them about Aunt B taking me in. I told them about finishing school and working at the crawfish place and going to Loyola. I did not tell them about the nights I sat on Aunt B's porch and could not breathe. I did not tell them about the guidance counselor who asked me to fill out emergency contact forms, and I wrote my aunt's name and then sat in the bathroom for 10 minutes afterward. Some things are mine. Darren was the one who surprised me. After dinner, he found me alone in the kitchen washing dishes, and he stood in the doorway and he said, "I want you to know I asked them not to leave you." He said I was 12, and I told Dad it was wrong, and Dad said you would be fine, and that Aunt B wanted you, and it would be temporary, and then it just was not temporary, and nobody talked about it, and after a while it became the thing we did not mention. He said, "I am sorry I did not try harder." I looked at my brother. He had our mother's eyes and our father's jaw, and he was crying without making any sound. And I dried my hands on the dish towel, and I said, "You were 12. You were a child. It was not your job." He nodded, but I could see he did not fully believe me, and I understood that, because I know what it is to carry something that was never yours to carry in the first place. They left the next morning. My mother cried again at the minivan. My father stood by the passenger door and said we would like to stay in touch, and I said I would like that too. And I meant it in the way that I mean it when I say I would like to visit Paris someday. It is true. It is sincere. It is not urgent. In the weeks that followed, my mother called every Sunday. I answered most of the time. The conversations were pleasant and shallow, like wading in warm water that never gets deep enough to swim. She told me about her garden. I told her about a case I was working on. We did not talk about the 17 years. We circled around them the way you drive around a sinkhole in the road. You know it is there. You just choose the lane that avoids it. My father sent me a letter. An actual paper letter in an envelope with a stamp. It was 4 sentences long. It said he was proud of me. It said he thought about what happened more than I probably knew. It said he hoped I could forgive him someday. It said he loved me. I read it twice. I folded it and put it in the drawer of my desk next to Aunt B's funeral program and the letter of acceptance from Loyola and the first business card I ever had printed with my name followed by the word attorney. I put it there not because it fixed anything, but because it was true, and true things deserve a place, even when they arrive 17 years late. There is a bench in Millennium Park that faces the Bean. Not the tourist side where everyone takes photographs, but the quieter side, where the curve of the sculpture reflects the skyline upside down. I sat there the evening after I put my father's letter in the drawer, and I thought about Aunt B. She used to say something to me when I was young and angry, and full of a heat I could not name. I would come home from school with my jaw tight because someone had said something, or done something, or looked at me the way people look at a girl who wears the same shoes 3 days in a row. And Aunt B would be at the stove with her back to me, and she would say it without turning around. She could hear the anger in how I shut the door. She would say, "Nora, still water runs deep, but it also runs clean. Let it settle. Then drink." I did not understand her then. I thought she was telling me to be patient. I thought patience was her lesson. But sitting on that bench with the Chicago wind pulling at my coat, I realized she had never been talking about patience at all. She had been talking about clarity. She was saying that when everything gets stirred up, when the mud and the debris and the hurt spin through you so fast you cannot tell what is real, you do not make your decisions then. You wait. Not because waiting is a virtue, but because you cannot see the bottom until the water goes still. And when it does, when you can finally see all the way down, then you know what to drink and what to leave. I had waited 17 years. That was longer than she probably meant. That was longer than anyone should have to wait to be seen by the people who were supposed to see them first. I know that now. I think I knew it then too, but I did not want to say it out loud, because saying it would mean admitting that I had chosen to wait, that some part of me had been standing at the window of that empty Rockford house long after I stopped being 15, long after I had the money and the credentials and the steel to demand what I was owed. Some part of me had kept the porch light on, even though no one was driving up that street. That is the part I have to be honest about. I could have called them. Any year, any month. I could have hired an investigator to find my mother's address in Arizona. I could have written to my father before he ever thought to write to me. I had the resources. I had the words. God knows I had the words. I used them every day in courtrooms and conference rooms and across tables where billions of dollars hung in the balance. But I did not use them for that. And the reason is uglier than silence. The reason is that I needed them to come to me. I needed the proof that they would choose me without being asked. I needed the story to end the way it should have begun, with my family walking toward me instead of away from me. That is not strength. I want to be clear about that. That is a wound dressed up in a suit. That is a 15-year-old girl wearing the face of a 42-year-old attorney who bills $900 an hour, pretending that her stillness is strategy, when really, it is just the old fear that if she reaches out her hand, someone will look at it and keep walking. Aunt B would have told me to stop that nonsense. She would have said, "The water settled a long time ago, Nora. You just did not want to look down." She would have been right. I think about the things I missed by holding my ground so perfectly. I think about Lucas growing up without knowing me at all, without knowing I existed beyond a name mentioned in whispers. I think about my mother's hands shaking in that conference room, and I wonder how many nights her hands shook before that. How many nights she sat alone in Scottsdale and thought about the daughter she left in a house that was no longer a home, and told herself the same lie I told myself, that it was the other person's job to reach out, that the one who was wronged gets to wait, that waiting is dignity. It is not dignity. It is fear with good posture. If Aunt B taught me anything real, it was that still water runs clean. But she never said to let it sit forever. She said, let it settle, then drink. I had done the settling. I had skipped the drinking. I had been so focused on letting the mud clear that I forgot the whole point was to eventually bring the cup to my lips and take what I needed and move. My father's letter sits in that drawer now, beside the things that made me. It is 4 sentences, and it is not enough, and it is also everything he had, and I recognize that shape. I recognize the person who has more inside than they know how to move from the chest to the mouth. I am that person. I have always been that person. The difference is I found courtrooms where precision passes for feeling. He never found his courtroom. He just found a stamp and an envelope and 4 sentences that probably took him all day. I will not call what happened forgiveness because that word is too clean for the truth. The truth is messier. The truth is that I understand and I am still angry, and I am tired of being angry, and I miss people I barely know, and I wish Aunt B were alive to tell me what to do with all of it. The truth is, still water does eventually run clean, but it takes longer than anyone tells you. And when you finally look down, what you see at the bottom is just yourself, standing there the whole time, waiting to be told it is safe to move. It is safe to move. I know that now. Not because someone finally said it, not because a judge ruled it or a letter confirmed it, or a therapist gave me permission on a Tuesday afternoon in her office on Sycamore Street, with the white noise machine humming behind the door. I know it because I woke up one morning last October, and the first thing I thought about was not my family. It was coffee. Just coffee. The way the light was coming through the kitchen window onto the counter, and how the mug I like best, the heavy blue one with the chip on the rim, was already sitting there from the night before because I had been too tired to wash it. I stood in that kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, barefoot on cold tile, and I poured coffee into a chipped mug, and I drank it standing up, and the first thought in my head was, "This tastes good." That was the morning I understood Aunt B's phrase, "Still water runs clean." She was not talking about patience. She was not talking about waiting for justice, or vindication, or the day the people who left you behind would finally weep and beg. She was talking about this. A Tuesday, a kitchen, coffee that tastes good because you are not filtering it through 40 years of asking why. She was talking about the moment you stop stirring the silt and just let yourself settle. I think about her hands a lot, the way they looked when she rolled dough, the flour caught in the creases of her knuckles. She had arthritis in both thumbs by the end, but she never stopped making bread because she said the dough needed her, and nothing else in the world was saying that at the time. I did not understand her then. I was 15 and everything she said sounded like something stitched on a pillow. Now I am 42, and I would give almost anything to sit at her table one more time and tell her she was right. Not about all of it. She was wrong about some things. She thought if I was good enough, they would come back. They did come back, but not because I was good. They came back because the internet made it impossible to pretend I did not exist. That is a different thing entirely. But she was right about the water. She was right about the standing still. I still practice law. I still win more than I lose. Last month I argued a custody case for a woman named Dara, whose ex-husband told their 8-year-old daughter that mommy chose work over family. I sat in the courtroom in Franklin County and listened to him say it under oath, casual, like he was reading a grocery list. And I felt the old electricity move through my hands, the charge that has nothing to do with billing hours and everything to do with knowing exactly what it costs when someone decides your absence is your choice. We won. Dara has her daughter on school nights now. She cried in the hallway outside the courtroom, and I handed her a tissue from the packet I keep in my jacket pocket, because after 17 years I have learned that someone always cries in the hallway, and it should not be me. Derek calls once a month. We talk for about 12 minutes. He tells me about his garden. I tell him about cases I can talk about. We do not mention the years between. We do not mention that. Sometimes the silence stretches and I can hear him breathing, and I think he is trying to figure out how to say something enormous, but the words are too big for the phone line, so he just says, "Well, I should let you go." And I say, "Okay," and we hang up. And that is what a relationship sounds like when it has been rebuilt, with only the materials available. It is not the house either of us wanted, but the roof holds. Mom and I do not speak. That is not a punishment. It is just the truth. Some distances are not bridges waiting to be built. Some distances are the answer. The evening is coming down over the rooftops outside my window as I tell you this. Columbus in autumn is not beautiful the way postcards are beautiful. It is beautiful the way real things are beautiful, which means it is also a little ugly, a little ordinary, leaves in the gutters and the smell of someone grilling on a balcony 2 floors down, and the sound of a dog barking at absolutely nothing across the street. I live here. I chose this. Every lamp in this apartment is one I picked out myself, and every book on the shelf is one I carried from one life into the next, and the silence in these rooms is mine. Not the silence of being forgotten, but the silence of having decided, very carefully, what I want to hear. If you are listening to this and you are the one who was left, I am not going to tell you it gets better, because that phrase never helped me, and I do not think it will help you. What I will tell you is that one day you will stand in your own kitchen, and the coffee will taste good, and you will realize you are not waiting anymore. You are just living, and it will feel so ordinary that you might miss it if you are not paying attention. Pay attention. That ordinary morning is the whole thing. That is what survival actually looks like. Not a courtroom, not a headline, not your family weeping when they find your name. It looks like a Tuesday and a chipped mug and light through a window, and you, still here, still standing, the water finally clear enough to see the bottom. And at the bottom, there is nothing to be afraid of. It is only you.